Welcome to URanch. Today we're going to be showing you how to do a caliper change. This is for the Mark V Grand Caravan, also applies to the Chrysler Town & Country. So we're going to be getting rid of this old, rusted up, seized up caliper and replacing it for a brand new one. So we're going from this to this. So let's get stuck in. Now, a quick thing to note when it comes to the Mark V Grand Caravan and the Chrysler Town & Country is they come with two different brake options. You have standard brakes or heavy duty brakes. And on this particular vehicle we do have the heavy duty version. But we have also filmed a version of this video showing the exact same procedure on the standard brakes as well as a video that shows you how to determine whether you've got heavy duty or standard if you're not sure which you have on your car. And we'll add links for both of those videos into the video description below in case you need them. But here on the rear of the car, the job is virtually identical regardless of which version you've got. So let's crack on. So just a quick overview of some of the main components here, just in case you're new to working on brakes. So what we have here is a two-part caliper that consists of the main caliper here, which is this central section right here, and then around the outside of that we have the caliper bracket. And the caliper bracket is actually bolted onto the hub of the car with their two bolts on the rear. And then this central section, the caliper itself, that's bolted on to the bracket through these bolts here that come in through slider pins into this section here. You'll see all this as we progress through the video. If you have a look in this little window here, right across the middle, that's going to be the edge of your rotor. And then either side of that, you're going to have the facing of the brake pad and the backing of the brake pad. So in this window, you get a good idea of what the condition of the pads is like. So the way that it works, you can see the handbrake cable coming up here, and it actually passes through this metal arm here that's attached onto the back of our caliper. And the cable itself passes through the very centre of this, and it's got a little hole in the end, and there's a hook here that passes through that hole. And on this little bracket here, a couple of things to note is where this passes through, this actually has a plastic tab, like a compression tab, top and bottom, that need to be compressed to get it through the hole. And also there is a little slot just in the front there, which is thick enough for this white section to pass through. The way that it works, we've got the end of our handbrake cable just here. You see there's a hook that passes through the end of our cable. And this is a little arm here that's attached onto the back of the caliper. As you can see, we have this spring on the opposite side. And what happens is when you press the parking brake, this whole arm will move in this direction. So the spring here will actually stretch. And then when you release the parking brake, the spring that's now in detention will pull this arm back down. So the position that we can see at the moment, this is with the parking brake not applied. Now, by far the easiest way to detach our handbrake cable is actually to get rid of the spring, because whilst that spring is there, we're always going to be fighting against it. And once we have this spring out of the way, then this arm here will be able to move. And that's going to give you the space that you need to be able to get this handbrake cable detached. So let's focus on the spring. So to remove this spring, what you want to do is grab yourself a large flathead screwdriver. And you'll find that where this hooks on, there'll be an end of the spring. Mine's on the rear here, unfortunately. It's usually easier if it's on the front. And if it's on the front, you can put this under the edge of it. You can just force it up quite easily and unhook it. Coming from the back is a little bit harder, so we'll show it to you using the harder of the two options, but the principle's the same. And make sure you're wearing eye protection when you're doing this, just in case this decides to spring off. So as mine's on the back, which is a little bit tricky. As I said, I would normally, if it's on the front, I'd do it like this. I don't really want to be pointing this tool towards me. So if it was on the front, it's nice and easy. You can just get it under that lip, start to force it up, and just feed it off. However, on the back here, I don't want to be really pointing the screwdriver towards myself. We do have a little flat edge just at the back here, so we can use that as a leverage point. So I can put this just under the edge of that spring there, and use this flat edge at the back as a point to lever from. So there we go, as simple as that. So all I did there is I kind of came up underneath it a little bit like that. Get it just under the edge, twisted it up inside it as much as I could, and then used the leverage. It came up the screwdriver and just came off of the front. So that is now detached. Now, in theory, if your caliper is nice and healthy, this little arm here, you should be able to push this over by hand. Unfortunately, you see our caliper is not in great shape, and this certainly isn't going to be moving by hand. So option number two, if yours is a little bit seized up like ours is you can press the parking brake down and use the cable to pull the arm across. Remember, it won't have the spring attached, so it will come straight to the full position in this direction. So as we can see, in our particular case, we have the worst case scenario. As I mentioned right at the start, you should literally be able to move this with your hand if you have a healthy caliper. But ours isn't moving even when we apply that parking brake. So the last thing we can try and do is try and get it manually moving using a hammer and our flathead screwdriver. To help us out a little bit, I'm going to put some penetration spray on the back here. It's going to be really useful for getting stuck components like this moving again. We're using liquid wrench, but you can buy anything. Standard WD-40 does a fairly decent job, and WD-40 also do a specialist penetrating oil very similar to this that you can pick up on Amazon at a really good price. As you can see, I've managed to get some of the pressure off of this cable now. And a quick tip for you if you are working on the parking brake cables. This is on the underside of the vehicle and we're on the driver's side, and we're about approximately about 3 feet from the rear wheels in that direction. If you have a look underneath, you can see this arrangement here. And this is the main cable. This goes up into the vehicle, is attached to the pedal, passes through a bracket here, single cable, goes into this little bracket, which then changes it into 2 cables. And the top cable, that's the driver's side one, and the bottom one, that's the passenger side. As you can see in our example, the passenger side is completely loose here. Yours won't be at an angle, yours will be straight. The reason for this is we're actually doing some work on the parking brake cable on that side, but ignore that, it won't affect anything that you're doing. And then our 2 cables pass along here into another bracket and then go off onto the calipers. And if you're struggling to get that parking brake unhooked, what you can do is you can help by creating a little bit more space just here. So you can actually pull this cable in this way a little bit, and of course by doing that, likewise these cables go in that direction. That's going to give you that little bit of extra space. This step is entirely optional, and you only need to do this if you're struggling to get it off. So what you can do, it's a little bit awkward, like I said, especially for us as we don't have this one attached. What you want to do is grab a clamp. You want to clamp between this point here and the edge of the bracket just there. So let's pull that in a little bit. I'll do the same with the other one at the top here. You can see we've now exposed a little bit of the cable, so we've pulled the cable in this direction, and you can also see we've got a bit of slack in our cable now. And sometimes this little trick can be exactly what's needed just to get that little bit of extra space to unhook it on the caliper. So now we've got plenty of movement on our cable here. However, because it's on a hook, we need to kind of lift it in this direction so we can unhook the end of it. So it needs to lift up like this, so then we can unhook it. Now sometimes, if you're lucky, you can kind of come under here, manipulate the cable a little bit, depends how much you've got available to you. We don't have quite enough. We're out by a few millimeters. So now I want to compress these 2 tabs that I have on the sleeve, one on the bottom, another on the top. And I'm going to use this as a leverage point here. I'm just going to push that backwards. What you're looking to do is get this front edge just in front of this bracket. So then you can feed this white part of the cable through the slot in the side. And as you can see, it'll unhook easy as pie. So what we want to do next is actually want to detach our caliper away from our caliper bracket, and to do that we need to get these 2 bolts on the top and bottom just here. As you can see, our calipers are pretty rusty, so I've got some penetration fluid here. This is plus gas. Always a good idea to use these penetration sprays, especially if you have got some corrosion like we have. So I'm just going to put a little bit here on the bolts, and I'll do the same on the bolts on the back here, because it does take a few minutes for this stuff to soak in. What it does is helps soak in behind the corrosion, get into the thread a little bit. Sometimes this can make the job a lot easier. Now grab your size 13 socket. I'm going to remove the top and the bottom bolts. These are the bolts that are holding the caliper onto our caliper bracket. And once your bolt's out, we actually want to put that back in for a second. and just tighten that up a little bit by hand, because we don't want this caliper to start moving as we're undoing the lower one. And so now we've got our bottom one removed, we can go ahead and remove the top one again. So now both removed. So now we want to slide the caliper off over the top of our brake pads. To enable us to do this, your parking brake must be disengaged, it must be off. Grab yourself a flathead screwdriver or a pry bar. A good place to get in behind the caliper is just here, in this little gap here. And you're going to work that there and just try and get things starting to move. Ours are pretty rusty and grotty here, but it's just starting to get a little bit of movement. There it comes. And we can do the same here at the bottom. There we go. This isn't the happiest caliper in the world, but he's slowly coming. So if you alternate between the top and the bottom, it should be 5 times easier to get yours off than what you're seeing here. This is kind of worst case scenario. Everything's all rusted and corroded up. If you keep alternating between top and bottom, it will come. Now, the problem that we've got on this particular caliper is there's been a problem with the parking brake on this one, and so I know that these are slightly compressed. Normally this should just slide straight off nice and easily. We're having to fight it a little bit here. You shouldn't have to. There it comes. Now it's important that we protect this flexible brake line that we've got here, so you don't want to leave this just kind of hanging off the car. You don't want to be putting weight onto that flexi hose. I've got a cable tie here. You just need to find somewhere suitable to tie it up. So I think I'm going to put it right here. So next we need to remove the old brake pads. Now the pads have little ears in them, just here, that sit inside these little metal brackets, which you can see here. So they should slide backwards and forwards in these brackets. However, as you can see, ours is pretty badly corroded, so I'm going to assume that ours aren't going to slide very easily. A good place to put the screwdriver is just here against the backing material of the pad. Just give it a light, gentle tap, just get it to start moving. And then once you've got a gap in there, you can put your flathead screwdriver in and start to lever it. Because what we've done is we've basically pushed that pad forward, so that pad's basically now it kind of forward at an angle like this, so we need to push the bottom of it back flat. So we're putting that in, giving that a pull, that should allow us to start leveling things up. Same on these ones. So for safety, we don't want the rotor accidentally coming off of the vehicle, so I'm putting a bolt back on here just to hold it in place. And it's always the best idea to put that as close to the 12 o'clock position as possible. Now if you are coming in behind the pad, like we are here, because ours are quite stubborn, if you're keeping your old rotor, if you're only doing a pad change, be careful when you put it in that you're only levering it in this direction. What you don't want to do is start pulling the tip of the screwdriver into the face of the rotor. So it's okay to put it in behind the pad and lever it from the edge of your rotor here onto the pad like so. What you don't want to do is start pulling it in this direction, because that's going to force this into the face of your rotor and could cause damage. And there's our first pad removed. It's going to be fairly gentle. These are a little bit delicate. You can see there's these kind of pins that hold them in, these little clips around the outside. So if you give it a wiggle, you can kind of see what's holding it in. Just gently give it a bit of a push all the way around, start loosening it off. Now we need to remove our caliper bracket. We've got 2 big bolts here on the back, one here, one down just there, and these are size 18. And then again, just like we did on the top ones, just going to pop that back in. Do that up a few turns just to stop this from moving whilst I attack the bottom one. So now we can undo these two bolts. We can remove the bracket away from the car. You may have this little extra bracket here that the clip goes through on the bottom, like we have here. If so, make sure you keep that and bring it all off together. Now when it comes to changing your caliper, it's also a really good idea to change this flexible brake hose that attaches to the back of it. Now in theory you could go ahead and use the old hose and just bolt the old hose onto your new caliper, but there's a reason why you should avoid doing that. Because what can happen in these lines is you get a kind of a build-up of corrosion and gunk over the years, and it can actually constrict the size of the inner diameter and starts to act as a one-way valve. So if you've got a hole that starts off that big but then corrosion builds up over time and time and time, that will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then what can happen inside this hose is when you put your foot on the brake pedal and you're putting pressure, hydraulic pressure down through this line, it will still force it through that small hole. However, when you then release the brake pedal, obviously you don't have pressure that's pushing it backwards, it just kind of rebalances itself. But what can happen is that pressure that you've pushed in, when you release it, if it's coming back through a very small hole, it won't have enough pressure to push itself back out. And so all the pressure basically remains in the caliper, and so your brake pads lock onto the rotor. And very often it happens that you think you may have like a seized caliper, but it's not the caliper, it's actually this flexible brake hose. And these hoses tend to be a lot cheaper than the calipers, so if you're putting a brand new caliper on there, it would be crazy not to replace this hose at the same time. Now before we disconnect this line from the car, as soon as we do that, obviously it's going to start dripping brake fluid. And we don't want to leave it doing that for too long, because obviously the air can get into the system. So you want to leave this brake hose disconnected for as short a period of time as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look at the brand new caliper and get our new hose attached onto it, make sure that it's 100% ready to be fitted back on, so that once this is disconnected we've got the whole unit ready to go straight back in. And whilst we go away to do that, I'm going to put some penetration spray on here, let that soak in. Okay, so let's have a look at the new caliper, the one that we have here. This one comes complete with the new shims for the pads, and we've also got a brand new banjo bolt there, and also the washer for that as well. So these brand new calipers are not necessarily very expensive. We picked up a pair of these brand new, and these were just $100 for the pair. And we will be adding Amazon links for these and similar calipers into the video description below, so if you'd like to help support us, please be sure to use our links. And it's worth remembering that there are heavy duty, which is what we have here, and standard brakes fitted to these cars. You need to know which version you have. Remember, we have done a video for that, so if you're unsure what you have on your vehicle already, please be sure to check that video out and that'll answer that question for you. And of course, another important thing to point out with these calipers is they are sided, so you can't buy two identical ones. You need to buy a pair or two separate ones, making sure you get one for either side of the vehicle. And also we've got the brand new brake hose. These again can be picked up pretty cheap on Amazon. I think we paid about $15 for this one, $15, $18, something like that. And we'll add links for these as well into the video description for you. And again, with these hoses, these are also sided, so you cannot buy two identical ones. And to help make life easy for you, we will add separate links for both the left and the right ones into the video description. And one other thing that you will find links for in that video description are a set of these, and these are flare nut spanners. And these are pretty much essential when it comes to working on brake lines. You're going to see us using these in just a minute when we are detaching the cable from the vehicle and reattaching it. This makes life a lot easier. And thankfully these aren't very expensive. You can pick up a set of these for about $15 on Amazon. Remember, we'll also have those links in there for you. So what we need to do now is get this hose attached onto the caliper. So our hose attaches just in here. It's got a little plastic cover in there, so get that removed. So next, make sure that your hose is definitely in the correct orientation. If you're unsure exactly how it goes, then it's worth comparing to the your old one still on the car. Grab the first of your copper washers. You should have got a pair either with the caliper or with your hose, or in our case both. One on there ready to fit, the other one on your banjo bolt. And so essentially this has a copper washer on both sides of it. So that's the top one in there, and there's the bottom one there. So now grab yourself a torque wrench. You need to torque this up. The factory spec on this is 24 Newton meters or 18 foot-pounds. So next we're going to remove these two bolts to separate our caliper from our bracket. It's always a good idea to make sure that these slider pins are properly lubricated. Now of course what we have here is brand new, so we shouldn't have any issues at all, but if you literally just pull it forward, so you've got a nice layer of grease on there. I don't know whether that'll show up on the camera. A nice layer of grease on here. And reinsert them. Make sure the gasket here, this rubber gasket, fits over this little lip. Give it a push, it normally pops on. So there you go, and then feel the action of it, and once you've got it nicely lubricated, it should be nice and smooth. So these are now ready to be fitted to the vehicle, so we can move on to the next stage, which is to remove the old one. This is now ready to swap over. Before we do that, one other thing to check is the brake bleed nipple here. Just make sure that that's definitely in the closed position. So before we disconnect our flexi hose, we've got this wheel speed sensor here. It clips into these little plastic brackets on the hose. Just need to pop both of these out. So now we need to look at removing this flexi hose. It comes off the back of the caliper, comes up into this bracket here, and then it changes into the hard line here of the vehicle itself. This is where these flare nut wrenches come in really handy, because they've got this slot in them. You can just fit them around the brake line and drop them into place. So a lot easier when you're working on brake lines to use these. This is the proper tool for the job. So just be careful as you do this. Work nice and slowly and make sure it's turning freely, which this one is. And make sure you've got a drip tray underneath, which you're going to definitely lose a few drips of brake fluid. Now it really doesn't matter, we're not going to lose very much because we're only going to leave this off of the car for a few minutes. Once it's disconnected, you don't want to leave it for hours just dripping brake fluid, which is why we've already prepped the new caliper ready to be fitted. So here comes the brake fluid now. Like I said, don't panic about it, it's not going to be off for long, and we will be topping this up later in the process when we refill the brand new caliper. So that should, yeah, we're now disconnected. So next we've just got this little plate that we need to remove, sat on top of our bracket here. This little plate needs to be removed to release the flexible hose. So it can be a little bit tricky to get out. They start to move out a certain distance, and then what I did is I put a smaller screwdriver up in the hole, a bigger screwdriver behind it, and I used basically the screwdriver in here to close the gap. So by doing that you can kind of pack this distance out a little bit and get a little bit more leverage. But that's how you do it. They're a bit of a fiddle, but you can get them out with a bit of a wrestle. As you can see, it's not quite free, so I'm just going to grab a rubber mallet. Of taps, and there we go. So now I can just remove my cable tie and get rid of the old caliper. Before I fit the new one, I'm just going to clean that up just a little bit. I'm just going to put another cable tie in just so that I can put the new caliper tied up in place. Now if you look very carefully at this kind of hexagonal shape that you've got sat right on the rear edge here, it's a hexagonal, but one side of it doesn't have a point. It's actually curved slightly on this side. Likewise, if you look at the hole that it's going through, you'll notice that it's hexagonal apart from on one corner, and that corner is rounded off. So this is designed to fit in one way only. You need to match that curved side, the side with no point, to the curved side in the bracket. If it's a tight fit, like ours is, just get a little flathead screwdriver, just make sure there's no corrosion on these inside edges here. Before you reinstall your clip, it's always a good idea to get your wire brush and make sure you give this a good clean off, get rid of any corrosion or dirt that's on there. Now, if you're struggling to get that into the hole, if you can't quite get it to fit properly, grab a wrench, put that on there, and then it'll allow you to kind of twist it, and you can also push the head of the wrench. If you wiggle it around a little bit, you should get it to go through. So now we'll take our little plate here, slide that underneath, and give that a gentle tap with the rubber mallet. That's all the way in, fully seated. So now this is secure, we can put the brake line back into the end and we can start doing that up. So when it gets towards the end, you want to snug it up so it's fairly tight, don't overdo it. Out there, yeah, that's good. And the reason that you don't want to overdo it is that it is possible to strip these out, these fixings. You want to be reasonably careful with it, but obviously you want it nice and snugged up. So another good thing to do is once you've got it in place, make sure you get rid of any trace of your penetration fluid and the old brake fluid. Get it really nice and bone dry around that whole area. And then what you can do when you come to test your brakes, once you've got this all back together, you pump the brakes a few times, you can come and inspect this just to make sure that you've definitely got no leaks from this area. So a quick look at the brake pads. When you're buying your brake pads, again, these aren't very expensive. Pads such as these on Amazon, you're looking at about $25 for a rear set. It's always worth making sure that the set that you get come with the replacement shims. So these are the metal shims that fit inside the caliper bracket, and the pads actually slide backwards and forwards in these. Always much better to get new ones whenever you can. And again, just to make things super easy for you, the Amazon links that we'll be adding into the video description for you will be sets that definitely include the shims. So what we want to do next is fit our new metal shims into our caliper bracket. Of course, if you don't have brand new ones, you can always clean up your old ones. Give them a good wipe over with a copper brush and get some brake cleaner on them. You can normally get them coming up pretty clean. Now if we look at our new shims, we've got 4 shims, but they're not all the same. If you lay them out like this, you can see we've got 2 pairs. Look at this little spring, it's on this side, but on these 2, the spring is on the opposite side. And the way that these fit in, they fit into these little slots here. And the spring here, this curved bit, needs to be on the outside. Obviously it can't be on the inside because the rotor sits on the inside. It needs to go on the outside. So that will be the correct position there for that shim. Also, you might be wondering what this little arm is actually for. If you've not seen this before, it might confuse you as to where the little tab on the pad actually sits in relation to this metal arm. This is actually a spring that's designed to help pull back the pad when you take your foot off the brake pedal. And the way that this goes on is you should have that little end of that tab. Hopefully you can see that alright. Just in that bottom corner there is on the front face of the pad there. So what happens is when you squeeze the brake pedal, the piston pushes the pads in this direction, and then you can see when you release, the spring wants to pull that pad back out. So it's just a kind of an added way of helping release the pressure when you take your foot off of the brake pedal. So always that little tab there just in there. It used to be on the front side, just in there. If you look on the shims, you've got these little metal arms, 3 of them, and they just literally clip into place. So what we want to do is line this up. Be careful with the little arm that's in the middle. And this just needs to be pushed down nice and solid. Just want to make sure that it seats all the way down. And then grab one of the opposite ones, and this one goes in on this side. Remember these little spring tabs, these little springs on the end, always to the outside, never to the centre. The rotor needs to be in the centre. Now of course repeat that on the other side for all 4. So now we want to add a little bit of brake grease into these to make sure that the pads can slide backwards and forwards nice and freely. This is just a standard brake grease. Again, there will be Amazon links for this. So it's a nice thin layer of grease across all of our facings here. So now we're going to fit the bracket back on. So carefully slide this over the rotor, and we've got our bolts here. And remember, on the lower bracket bolt here, if you have this little plate, that needs to go back in place. So now grab yourself a torque wrench, and we need to torque these up 100 Newton meters or 74 foot-pounds. Okay, now on your new pads, always a good idea to put a little bit of grease just on these ends, just here. This is the part that slides in and out of our little metal shims here, just giving them a little bit of extra lubrication. Now with regards to the squeal arm, that's just a little metal arm that we have here, and basically what that does, as when your brake pad wears down, it will start to touch the bottom of this metal directly onto the rotor, and that will start making a squeaking sound, so you know that it's time to replace them. As a general rule of thumb, these should always be placed on the leading edge. So if you imagine that the car's moving forward, this wheel would be moving in this direction, and so this would be the leading edge, which is actually the bottom. And remember, we do have these little funny spring clips that we were talking about earlier. We want to make sure we end up on the correct side of those. So I'm going to angle these slightly inwards, just past those spring clips. Twist the whole thing around and push it in. Then just make sure you've got nice free movement. You can slide backwards and forwards nice and freely. So now you want to do exactly the same for the pad on the rear. I've just applied some grease there. And one thing to bear in mind, again, if you have the squeal arm on the bottom, which is the leading edge. And also with your grease, be careful if you've got grease on your gloves. You don't want to be applying grease to the face of your pads. The pads are slightly absorbent, and so if you put grease on there, it will actually soak in. Obviously that's going to have a very bad effect on the performance of your brakes. So be sure not to get any grease on your faces here. Another option is to put a little bit of grease here on the backing, just where the two arms sit. Just helps stop things binding together. It's not really necessary on the more modern pads. They've already got these backings on them, but it does help. You probably saw earlier in the video how badly binded up all of ours were and corroded. This should just help just that little bit. So now just offer the whole thing up, and it should slide in over the top. Push your these slide bolts, slide pins, just push them back if they're in the way. Should line up just around there. When you come to tighten these bolts up, you'll find that the slider pin will want to spin around. But you can see it's got a little flat edge on the underside of it. It's a size 19 on this particular one. So what I can do is I can put that on there, and that allows me to counter hold it to stop this turning when I do the bolt on the rear. And grab your torque wrench, and we're going to torque this up to 35 Newton meters, which is 26 foot-pounds. Remember to counter hold. And then do exactly the same on the bottom. And remember, we've got this wheel speed sensor. It needs to be clipped in to these clips on the brake hose here. So next up, we need to have a think about our brake fluid, because of course that brand new brake caliper that we've just fitted doesn't have any fluid in it, it only has air. And so we need to replace that air that's in the caliper with our brake fluid. And to allow us to do that, what we need to do is to bleed the brakes on that rear caliper. As you can see, we've got a warning on here, clean filler cap before removing. And that's because you don't want any dirt or dust particles getting into the brake fluid. Now our cap there is pretty clean, but we will give it a quick clean just before we remove it. So now we're going to remove the lid. Just put that carefully to one side. And the brake fluid colour that we have in here is particularly dark, and that's most likely because the faulty caliper that we've just replaced has been locked on and actually overheated our brake fluid. So what we'll be doing in our particular case, we will be doing a full brake fluid change on this car, just to make sure that we flush out all of this old fluid. And if yours is looking dark like ours is in here, which it might do if you've also had a faulty caliper, then it's definitely worth doing that change. And if you do want to do a full brake fluid change, we have recorded a separate video on that, and we will add a link for you in the video description below. So in this video, we'll show you how to do the bleed on the caliper that we've replaced, but if your fluid's not good and you want to do the whole thing, be sure to check out that video. Now, before we start the bleed on our new caliper, there's one really important thing that you need to bear in mind throughout the process. And that is that this reservoir here must never be allowed to go dry. Because if all of this fluid that's in there gets sucked into the system, the next thing it will suck in will be air. And thankfully, it's very easy to avoid that. All you need to do is keep an eye on the level of fluid that's in here. And as that fluid is bleeding through the system, this level will slowly go down. So keep an eye on it and top it up as required. Now, one very important thing is, even if you intend to do a full brake fluid change, before you do that, we need to make sure that we get that brand new caliper that we've just replaced filled with brake fluid, get that air out of the system before we do anything else. So we'll show you that process, and if you want to go on and do the full change, you can check out the other video. Now, before I start the bleed on my new caliper, I just want to take a note of the brake fluid level. And currently I'm sitting a little bit over minimum, but I've got quite a lot to get up to my maximum mark there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the maximum mark. So I'm going to put some fresh brake fluid in just to take it up to that maximum mark in our reservoir. Just going to put some blue paper down in here just in case we get any drips. And we've got a nice clean funnel we're going to use for putting in the fresh fluid. Doesn't take much, just a little few drops. And we're there. And just remember, throughout the bleed process, you need to keep an eye on the level. Do not let this run dry. So now let's get over to the caliper and get ourselves set up for the bleed. The best way to collect the old brake fluid is to use one of these little DIY bottles. This is just made from an old pop bottle and a piece of tubing. And if you want to make one of these yourself, we do have a DIY instruction video on how to do it. And we will add a link to that video into the video description below. Alternatively, you can buy versions of these on Amazon for around the $15 to $20 mark, and we'll add some Amazon links for those as well for you. Just want to find somewhere where I can easily hang the bottle here, so I'm going to do it around the bracket just here. So now we need to look at attaching our tube onto the brake bleed nipple on the caliper. So here's the bleed nipple, and as you can see, we do have a little rubber cap on there, so we need to get that removed. Now we can attach our tube directly onto the end of the bleed nipple there. You want a fairly tight fit because you don't want any air entering through the base of the tube. So let's briefly look at how this process works. So currently we have air instead of fluid inside the brand new brake caliper. And when we open the bleed nipple here and we apply pressure to the system, that will force brake fluid down the lines, and that will force the air, and the air will actually come out of this pipe. And we need to keep applying pressure to the system so it pushes out all of the air, and then we'll see that the air that's in there gets replaced with brake fluid, so the brake fluid will start coming through. And at that stage you want to make sure that we keep the pressure on a little bit longer, just to see if we get any little air bubbles, any little traces of air, pockets of air that are still coming out. And what we want to see eventually is we want to see a nice flow of fluid coming out of the bleed nipple here, but without any air bubbles. So how do we apply pressure to the system to force the air and the fluid out of our brake nipple? Well, by far the easiest way to do it is to get a second person to help you that can just jump into the driver's seat. And then what we'll do is we'll open the bleed nipple and we'll tell the person in the driver's seat to start pressing down the brake pedal. And as that second person presses the brake pedal down, that will pressurize the system and that will start to push pressure through the system, which is going to force the air out eventually to be replaced with fluid. However, there is one really important thing that the person pressing that brake pedal must remember whilst they're doing this. And that is, as soon as you open that bleed nipple, and of course you have released the pressure on the system. And so that brake pedal will be able to go all the way down to the floor of the car. And of course that's completely different to how it is when you drive the car. When you drive the car, the pedal is under pressure, and so you can press it down a little bit, but it won't get anywhere near the floor. And whatever you do, you don't want to push that brake pedal all the way down to the floor. The reason being is that inside the master cylinder you've got a main piston, and around the end of that piston you tend to get a build-up of crud over time. Now that's normally not a problem because you have a certain amount of travel that piston is used to doing. However, if you then jump in the car and then instead of doing this normal amount of travel you suddenly push it all the way down to the floor, then you're likely to snap that crud off and get it into the brake system. So it's really important to remember, whoever's pressing that brake pedal down, do not press it all the way down to the floor. Just do it about halfway at maximum and release, and just keep that going. You're much better off doing 10 shorter strokes than you are 5 full strokes. And the other thing to remember, of course, is make sure you keep an eye on the brake fluid level in the reservoir under your hood. You don't want that to run dry. And once again, this is where these flare nut spanners come in really handy because they fit over the tube. So I can put that onto the tube and put that down onto the nipple. So these are really handy. These are the best tool when you're doing brake work. And remember, we will add some Amazon links for cheap sets of these if you don't already have them. So now I'm going to get that second person into the car, and I'm going to be releasing the brake nipple and advising them to start pressing the brake pedal down, and we're going to watch all the air come out of here to be replaced by fluid, and we're going to keep that flowing until we definitely have no air bubbles. And then when we want to close this off, you're best closing it off when the brake pedal is being pressed down. So if you say to the person, one last stroke, and as they start to do it, close it, that's the best place to close it, because you're closing it with the pressure coming into the caliper, rather than when you let it go, it eases out a little bit and will pull back out. So always, if you can, get that person to press that brake pedal down, and as they do it, lock it off on the final stroke. Okay, so I'm now ready to start the bleed process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the person in the car to put some pressure on the brake pedal, whilst I then start to open this. Okay, a little bit of pressure, light pressure on. So here it goes, we can see the air coming out now. Nice and slow. Still getting the occasional air bubble. Still a couple of tiny little air bubbles coming through. Getting close now though. Unfortunately, as you can see, we've got the occasional air bubble that's coming out, and the bleed nipple is completely closed. And the reason for that is the air is actually getting in just under the edge of our pipe here. Because on this particular bleed nipple, the part that you attach the pipe onto is particularly short. Now 9 times out of 10 you can get away with just putting this straight on there. But like I said, because this one's particularly short, we are having an issue, so it's hard to tell when the air has left the caliper, because of course we're getting a slight bleed from around the edge just here. Now you can pick these up for a few dollars on Amazon, and these can be really helpful, especially if you do have a shorter nipple length like we do here. And we will add some Amazon links for these. Like I said, most times, 9 out of 10, you won't need them. On this particular one, because it's so short, you're going to need something that's going to give us a bit of a better seal on here. Okay, start some pumps. Okay, so there's looking good. So are you ready? Going to do one more and hold it. Ready? Go. So I did at the end there, I just made sure that I locked that off, closed that valve on the downstroke of the pedal. So I've got the person to press the pedal. As soon as they start to do that, then you close it off. So just double check, make sure it's nice and snug. Don't over tighten it. Remember these are only aluminium casings. Nice and snug. Clean up any excess fluid. So we want to make sure when we come back and check this, we're going to check this to see if we have any leaks there. We want to make sure that if we do have any fluid now from spillage, etc., we don't want to mistake that for a leak. So get that as nice and clean and dry as you can. And then the cap can be put back on. Now that we've got the brake nipple closed off, there's a couple of quick checks that we should do before we move on. The first is to make sure that our piston here is reseated correctly against the brake pads. So we'll just get the person in the car to do a couple of pumps and we'll watch what happens here. So as you can see, the piston's definitely come out and it's compressing, and then when the brake pedal's released, it's contracting just that little bit, compressing and contracting just that little bit. That's absolutely perfect. So our piston has come out properly as we would expect and appears to be seated correctly here. So the next thing to double check is just to make sure that we don't have any leakage around the brake bleed nipple just here. Because remember, we've just added pressure to the system by making sure that piston is seated correctly. So we've had full pressure into this system. Make sure you've got no leaks here. If you have, then it's not tight enough. Snug it up a little bit more. And then the next place to check for leaks is our hose up here. This is our flexi hose right here coming up off of our caliper. Remember, we attached the line in here to make sure that we definitely got no traces of brake fluid in here. Again, if we have, it's not tight enough, it needs to be done up. We've got nothing here, it looks nice and bone dry. And the last place to check is on the other end of our flexi line. Remember, we've got this banjo bolt here, so our flexi line comes up here and attaches onto our caliper. Remember, we replaced this earlier in the process. Just make sure that we're nice and dry, we don't have any traces of leaks around there as well. Now, to give us the space, we need to make sure that this little arm is free here. The parking brake cable hooks over this little section there, and when you push the parking brake pedal down, this little arm will move in this direction, making the spring longer. And when you release that parking brake, the spring will pull that arm backward, which is in the position that it's in right now. So to give us a little bit more space, we need to make sure that our spring is detached. You're going to get a flathead screwdriver and just come up under the edge of the spring there. You've got to do a little bit of a stretch. All you're trying to do is get it over this little hump just here. And a little tip for you when you do this, rather than try and get underneath it and just push it all the way up and then move it all the way across, use the flat edge of the screwdriver there to help you. So you find if you push it a little bit and then you start to force it across with the screwdriver, see how easy that is? And he's off. So what I'm trying to do now, this little arm, I'm trying to push it in this direction so that I can hook on the cable here. Now they can be quite tight, but I'm going to try and push that as hard as I can in this direction and then hook that over the top. Hopefully I can manipulate this enough in that direction to meet the cable. So that little trick with the clamps gave me plenty more space here. I was able to get that on relatively easily. You probably heard the clamp pop off and fall to the floor just as I was getting that on as I pulled that through. But if you do need that extra space, you can see how much extra we were able to get there. That made the job a lot easier. And at this point, if you still have those clamps in place, we need to detach them, because now, rather than wanting to pull the cable in this direction, we need to go in this direction. So you don't want to be fighting against your clamps. So next we've got to get this collar to fit through this hole. And to do that, I've got a little slot down on the side here, and so we need to get this white cable, the inner cable, down to this point down here, so it will slide in, and then we can pull this collar back through the hole. You need to expose as much of this white inner cable as possible to get it through the little slot. So you've got to be quite strong and tough with it. You can see it will come. There. Let's let that go back through the hole. There's that locking tab on the top and the bottom. They'll just snap into place. Now for the spring, just on the bottom of this arm right here, see it's got a little groove cut out of it. That's where the spring sits, the underside of the spring, just in that groove there. That's before we're going to use our flathead screwdriver to stretch it up over the bump there. So now, as we can see, our spring's in place. Now they can be hard to get on, especially when they're brand new like this one. You've got to put quite a lot of force on it. But just get just over that hump and it should snap into place. And so that's how to replace the rear caliper on your Grand Caravan or Town & Country. So safety first, before you jump onto the highway and start doing 120 kilometers an hour, you really want to test these brakes first. Best way to do it is just to drive slowly backwards and forwards on your own driveway and just make sure that the brakes appear to be operating correctly. And if everything seems good, take it for a short, slow drive around the block. Again, just making sure that everything feels exactly as it should. That brake pedal should feel nice and firm and the brakes should be good and reactive. And if all of that is good, then we are job done. If this video has been helpful for you, it would be really good of you if you could please use our Amazon links to buy any of your brake components. So thank you once again, we do appreciate it. Hopefully you'll hit that like button for us before you leave. Also be sure to subscribe, we've got hundreds more videos on these cars just waiting for you to check out. Thank you again, we'll see you down the road.